Chapter 12. Shifting Perspectives. Chapter 12. Shifting Perspectives. I hope you enjoy. The next several days were quite uneventful. Realizing that in his carelessness the day before, he'd managed to reinforce Snape's negative opinion of him yet again. Harry knew he had to keep his head down if he didn't want his relationship with Snape to revert to its former state of open hatred. At the moment, it seemed to be more barely suppressed dislike. He'd had plenty of practice as a kid making himself inconspicuous, and sure enough, it seemed to be going pretty well so far. Over the past 3 days, he'd only seen the two Slytherins at meals, and even then, their interactions were minimal. Since Snape clearly hated it when Harry was late to meals, he'd made a habit of heading down a few minutes early. As a result, Harry hadn't even seen Malfoy in the hallway on his way to breakfast. The Gryffindor wasn't consciously trying to avoid the Blonde, as for whatever reason, Malfoy was being much more tolerable nowadays. It was just that Malfoy clearly had a habit of waiting until the last minute to leave his room. Probably still primping, Harry had thought with a roll of his eyes one morning as he passed the boy's door, which was still firmly shut. Snape would lead the mealtime conversation, and the topics he favored were usually either related to high-level potions research or pureblood politics. While these topics were not uninteresting in and of themselves, Harry didn't know enough to contribute, even if he had felt welcome to. Malfoy would occasionally try to include Harry. "What do you think, Potter?" which surprised the hell out of him. He appreciated the gesture, but Harry was pretty sure Snape wouldn't want Harry to be a part of the discussion, even if the Gryffindor had had something to add. Snape might not have even consciously been trying to send those signals, but Harry thought he had a pretty good sense for when his input wasn't wanted. He'd had to survive his childhood. So, generally speaking, Harry sat silently and ate his food while the others debated various topics. It was stifling, and he ended up feeling a bit depressed come the end of the meal. But the moment breakfast ended, Harry would immediately cheer up, as he now had a place to escape to. The instant it felt polite to do so, he would excuse himself, thank Snape for the meal, and run off to his garden. He knew it really wasn't his, but it somehow felt right to think of it that way. It felt like his own private little oasis. Harry felt welcomed there, and he meant that quite literally. Every time he entered that section of the forest, he felt the magic of the place wrap around him as if in greeting, sweeping his worries and loneliness away. He never did much while there. He would just simply take a seat on the mossy ground by the rows of flowers and let different smells waft over him, listening to the birds and other sounds of the forest and generally just savoring the peace. He would usually start his day in the garden and then leave to visit the owlery or something. But once, he dozed off on the mossy ground and ended up staying there all morning. Luckily, he had got in the habit, since his last misstep, to make use of a variation on the Tempest charm, so his wand would alert him 20 minutes before he needed to return for lunch, so he hadn't been late again as of yet. In the afternoon, he'd mostly holed up in his room, reading his defense book and really only leaving to visit Hedwig. He hadn't yet opened the potions book Snape had given him. It sat, neglected, on the desk in his room. He knew he was probably being immature. A voice that sounded curiously like Hermione would occasionally chide him that he could benefit from a better understanding of potions fundamentals. But the thought of it just left a bad taste in his mouth. Even though he was used to it by now, he still hated the way Snape blamed him for everything, most recently, when he'd handed him the potions book and suggested that Harry should have been able to catch up over the years, framing his failure to do so as another mark against him. When in reality, the man didn't know the first thing about him. Plus, it was partially Snape's own fault Harry was behind in the first place. Potions was Harry's least favorite class, not counting Umbridge's excuse for Dada. That is. But before the first class session, it had been one of the classes Harry had most been looking forward to. Harry still remembered how excited he'd been going to the apothecary and picking out ingredients. He'd even opened the textbook before the first class, not comprehending what he was looking at, but feeling giddy at the thought of all he would learn. though he was sure Snape would never believe that. But that's why it rankled. He'd really been ready to work hard and love the subject, but Snape's cruel treatment of him from day one had squashed any desire Harry had. Sure, the man was being more decent to him at the moment, but he obviously really hadn't changed his opinion of Harry. He still saw him as lazy and disrespectful. So for now, Harry let that book sit unopened. Needing to stretch his legs, Harry walked the familiar route to the owlery. When he arrived, he saw his snowy owl was sharing a perch with Malfoy's eagle owl, but at his entrance, flew over to greet him. She landed on his shoulder and gave his ear a little love bite. He smiled and stroked her feathers. Other than the eagle owl, there was another owl here, too, at the moment, a great horned owl he assumed was Snape's. They both regarded Harry calmly as he and Hedwig crossed the room to the window. He missed his friends, Ron and Hermione, Ginny, Luna, Neville, but more than anything, he missed his godfather. To have met the man only to have him ripped away before they were able to really be together was just so cruel. And the thought of how much Sirius had suffered all those years in Azkaban just made it that much worse. Harry looked up at the sound of wings flapping to see Malfoy's eagle owl taking flight. Harry watched the owl as it flew through the window and around the side of the manor. A moment later, the owl reappeared, perched on the end of Malfoy's broom. At the moment, the Blonde was gliding along at a relaxed pace, affectionately stroking his owl. Harry was surprised. He had just assumed that Malfoy would see an owl as nothing more than a tool to deliver his mail, but his rival continued to surprise him. The owl took flight again, and then the two started to fly around the yard together. Little by little, Harry was finding his opinion of Malfoy was changing. Sure, he was an arrogant prat, but he clearly wasn't evil. Harry hadn't forgotten the conversation they'd had the other night, when Malfoy had admitted that he'd never be a Death Eater and that their methods had never appealed to him. Thinking back, though the Slytherin had always talked big, he had never done anything truly violent in their altercations. Harry had always just assumed that was because Malfoy was a bit of a coward, which he was still pretty sure was the case. The Blonde could be cruel, no doubt. He was manipulative and self-centered and didn't care who his words hurt, or at least that's how it had seemed to Harry. But Malfoy had been decent the last few days. Seeing the Blonde flying reminded Harry again of how much he missed it. He wouldn't say no to a game of Quidditch with his rival, even if they could have a friendly game, that is. After all, Malfoy was a talented flyer, for all that he'd bought his way onto the Slytherin Quidditch team. Looking back at it now, Malfoy's father dropping all that money on brooms for the team probably hadn't done his son any real favors. It just made everyone assume that Malfoy was only on the team because of the money, rather than for his skills. But Harry had faced off against him enough times to say that he should have been able to make it onto the team that year or the year after on merit alone. Harry said bye to Hedwig and headed down to dinner. He tried to lay low for a few days longer and see what happened. Maybe he should stop being stubborn and actually start on the assignment Snape had given him. If things stayed moderately peaceful, maybe he could try his luck talking to Snape about his broom and the letters to his friends. HPSSDM the next day, Harry again visited his garden after breakfast, but returned to his room a few hours before lunch. Unable to rationalize procrastinating any longer, he sat down at his desk, grabbed his quill and parchment, and opened the potions book from Snape. It had a nice old book smell that Harry realized he enjoyed. The first few pages were slow going, and he found himself rereading the same sentence several times, more than once. But he tried to redouble his efforts, and before long realized he'd finished the introductory chapter. And it had actually been pretty interesting. It discussed the importance of not just memorizing steps, but of understanding how every action you take in the creation of the potion affects its final outcome. The way you prepare the ingredients, the order in which you add them, the direction and speed with which you stir the potion, under what conditions ingredients were grown and harvested, and so on and so forth. Adjustments made to these and other factors would apparently bring out entirely different qualities from the ingredients and result in entirely different potions, even if the ingredients and their quantities were the same. The book explained that, while introductory potions students are usually taught to just follow recipes, there is almost always more than one way to create a potion, and understanding the different factors that can affect a potion can enable you to come up with creative new ways to make a potion, as well as open the door for developing new potions. Harry blinked, realizing that he had enough in his head now to write a quick summary for the first section, so he took a moment to do so. This was actually really fascinating stuff. This was what he'd wished he could have learned back when he'd been excited about the prospect of potions. Why had Snape never told them any of this? He had just left them to muddle through everything and derided them when they screwed up. This was obviously basic stuff that they should have had explained to them at the beginning. Most likely, Snape thought this was all too basic to bother with explaining. After all, hadn't Hermione said something about him being the youngest ever potions master or some such rot? It had probably come so naturally to him that he couldn't conceive of students needing to have this spelled out. Well, fine, but he should never have been a teacher if that was his attitude. Presumably, Snape loved potions, or at least liked it, as it was hard to think of Snape loving anything except maybe Draco, admittedly. But he'd totally failed to convey that to his students. It was a shame. But at least Harry didn't think he minded being told to read this book anymore. At lunch, the two Slytherins talked about potions. The discussion was way above Harry's head, but Malfoy seemed to have no problem keeping up with Snape. Snape had probably given Malfoy private lessons since he was little, Harry suddenly realized. The boy had been given a totally unfair advantage from the get-go. Plus, Harry thought with annoyance, the boy would have known what sorts of ingredients to throw at the Gryffindors to sabotage their potions. Git. In the afternoon, he did more reading and then took a quick walk around the grounds, not going so far as his garden this time, making sure to get to the dining room a few minutes before dinner. After dinner, he returned to his room and debated what he should do. Even though he was enjoying the potions book more than expected, he'd reached his limit for one day. Potter. Harry looked up at the familiar, haughty voice. Why exactly have you been avoiding me? Harry stared at the blonde who stood, arms crossed, in his doorway. What are you talking about, Malfoy? The Slytherin threw up his hands in exasperation. You're never anywhere to be found. First off, you run down to the dining room before those of us normal people are even out of bed, and then you're completely missing all morning afterwards. Not even the servants knew where you were. The servants. You mean the house elves, Harry said with obvious annoyance in his voice. Malfoy waved him off. Same thing. I asked them to locate you yesterday morning and they couldn't. Anyway, you've clearly found a great hiding spot. Suddenly, his eyes lit up in mischievous curiosity. So, where is it? Malfoy had been talking for all of 15 seconds, and already Harry could feel a headache coming on. The blonde had been looking for him in the mornings, and had even asked the house elves for help locating him. Those things were all surprising, but what interested Harry the most was that, for some reason, the garden must not register with the house elves, because that is where he'd been, hiding, for the majority of the mornings. It was called a secret garden, after all. Maybe the path wouldn't open for everyone. That hadn't occurred to him before, but if it were true, then the place was even more special than he'd realized. And he wasn't about to share its secret with the likes of Malfoy, even if he was being less of a prat. Why would I tell you, Malfoy? We're all allowed our little secrets. The blonde looked offended, but then a look of understanding dawned on his face. Potter, if it's Severus you're worried about, you needn't be concerned. It can be our little secret. Nice try, Malfoy. I don't think so. Malfoy opened his mouth to continue to argue, but Harry held up a hand, cutting him off. But seriously, I wasn't trying to ignore you. Exactly. I didn't expect you to be looking for me, the blonde sniffed haughty. Very well. I suppose I shall permit you to keep your secret, he said magnanimously, sauntering into Harry's room as if he owned the place. Permit, Harry mouthed while rolling his eyes. For now, that is, Malfoy continued. Whatever you say, Malef. Harry broke off suddenly. What are you doing now? The Bland was rearranging Harry's furniture with his wand, transfiguring Harry's desk chair into a fluffy armchair, this one more opulent-looking than the one already in the room, before letting himself fall gracefully into it. He motioned to the chair opposite for Harry to sit down. Entertain me, Potter. The nerve of the guy was incredible. I'm not one of your goons, Malfoy. Fine. The boy sat up and grinned at him. Want to play wizard's chess? What if I say no? How bored was the Bland to come barging in like this, demanding attention so shamelessly. Malfoy just shrugged, not fazed in the slightest. I'll just have to ask again later, then, Harry sighed. Fine, Malfoy, we can play, I guess. I warn you, though, I'm rubbish. Oh, tusk, Potter. You should know better than to talk so openly of your weaknesses to your enemies. Harry knew the boy was still pulling his leg to a certain extent, but he also sensed a bit of a challenge, maybe even a question in the boy's words. That may be, he said lightly. As you and Snape never fail to remind me, I'm a foolish Gryffindor who wears his heart on his sleeve. But you're not my enemy, Malfoy. Not really. Harry looked the boy in the eyes, and then was shocked to see two little pink spots had appeared on Malfoy's cheeks. The Slytherin even broke eye contact. Oh, he said a long moment later. Yeah, I just realized it recently. I'm a little slow, I guess. But yeah, you're my rival Malfoy, not my enemy. Malfoy looked like he was back to his usual self now, which made Harry sigh in relief. You're a soft fool, Potter. But he didn't sound like he really meant the words. Well, anyway, if you want a good match in wizard's chess, you should challenge Ron sometime. The weasel, Malfoy said with disdain. Harry just stared at him deadpan until the Bland held his hands up and smirked. Fine, dear Ronald, I mean. You say he's actually decent at chess. More than decent. He's the one who beat McGonagall's giant chess game back in first year. Draco's eyes lit up at the information. You're kidding. They were always so secretive about all that. Tell me what really happened. It was half demand, half request, but Harry could tell Malfoy was really dying to know, and it's not like it could do any harm to satisfy the Bland's curiosity, so he took him through the whole thing, starting with the Cerberus, and how they'd learned music lulled it to sleep, the devil's snare. The flying Keesand even gave him a brief overview of the face-off with Voldemort and the mirror. Malfoy was silent for a long moment after Harry finished talking, though he'd been making commentary and asking questions throughout. Don't you find it strange? Ha! Dumbledore. Why was his great protection something a handful of first-year students could get through? Harry blinked. His first impulse was to defend the old wizard, but Malfoy did actually bring up a good point. I guess. Maybe he thought the mirror was the only protection the stone would need. Malfoy was nodding. But I don't think that's the only reason. He looked up at Harry seriously, his eyes wide as if he'd just come to some big revelation. I think he actually intentionally made it first-year level so you could get through it. You're starting to talk nonsense, Malfoy. No, think about it. Malfoy had stood up and was now pacing. It makes sense. Remember how he rewarded you and the others at the year-end feast for risking your lives and taking on the Dark Lord. Don't you find that strange, when most teachers would reprimand students for risking their lives? Sure, Dumbledore's not your average teacher, but even so. It sounds to me like the old coot set a trap for you and you walked right into it, just as he'd planned. Harry was shaking his head, but Malfoy continued his rant. It has to be because you're the boy who lived, and it was the first example of you playing that part, of the boy who fights evil. I remember my house was so excited to win the cup after so many years, and then suddenly Dumbledore starts handing out insanely large rewards for rather arbitrary things. We were devastated that he stole the cup from us. But if he was trying to reinforce a behavior by rewarding your risking your life and going after the Dark Lord, I don't think, Harry trailed off. He wondered if there could indeed be some truth to what Malfoy was saying. At the very least, it was strange that the protections had been so basic if they were supposed to keep out the great and powerful Lord Voldemort. And Dumbledore sure had seemed proud of him in the hospital wing after he'd woken up. Extremely proud. It also, Harry realized with shame, had never occurred to him that the Slytherins would have been hurt by Dumbledore's actions that night. The Gryffindors had been overjoyed, of course, and he for one hadn't spared a thought for the Snakes. After all, they were the evil house, right? Harry could now see how juvenile and outright wrong that sort of thinking was. Remembering how he'd almost been sorted into Slytherin himself, he wondered if he would have seen Dumbledore as such a hero that night if he had indeed been sorted differently. Harry shook his head. Look, Malfoy. I'm not going to say you don't bring up some interesting points, but you're making Dumbledore out to be this evil mastermind. And what if he is? Okay, fine, Malfoy conceded at Harry's dubious look. Maybe not evil exactly, but you have to admit the man's manipulative. He really likes to be in control. He might think he's doing what's best for everyone, but he's not always right. Unbidden, Harry remembered all the times he'd asked to be able to stay at Hogwarts, anywhere other than with the Dursleys. Fine, I'm not going to say he doesn't make mistakes sometimes, but I still think you're reading a little too much into this. Malfoy looked like he wanted to say something else, but then just nodded. I'll drop it for now, Potter. Suddenly, he grinned. How many games have I won? 3 out of 3, Harry sighed. I told you, if you want a tough match, ask Ron next time instead of hexing him. It might be hard to restrain myself, Malfoy snarked. He yawned. I suppose I better get to sleep soon. It's probably late. Sure. See you tomorrow then, Malfoy. The blonde got up and cancelled the charm on Harry's desk chair. He looked like he wanted to say something for a moment, but then seemed to change his mind. Yeah, not so much hiding, Potter. Harry rolled his eyes. I'm allowed to have some time to myself, Malfoy. Careful, Potter. You don't want to end up like Severus. Again, not funny, Malfoy. The blonde laughed out loud before waving and leaving to return to his room. HPSSDM that night, Harry dreamed about Sirius again. But this time, kindly blue eyes were watching him the whole time. Help me, Professor, Harry called out frantically. I'm afraid it's too late, my boy, but don't despair. It's for the greater good. Harry woke up sweating. Now that he was recovered, Snape wasn't supplying him with dreamless sleep, so he was back to his daily nightmares. Damn Malfoy for planting doubts about the old wizard in his head. Harry sighed and tried to get back to sleep. Thank you for reading. Let me know your thoughts if you get a chance. Chapter 13. A Warming Relationship. Chapter 13. A Warming Relationship. Thank you so much for the comments. Enjoying lounging around, are you, Potter? It was the following evening, and once again, Malfoy had barged into Harry's room. And there Harry had been enjoying a nice visit with Hedwig, who was currently perched on his arm as he sat in his armchair, reading the potions book. Harry rolled his eyes, sighing in half-feigned exasperation. Despite himself, Harry was starting to get used to the blonde Slytherin's personality, at least so far as to be able to tell the difference between the boy being simply annoying versus trying to start a fight. Because the two modes were far too similar. It was clear to Harry that Malfoy was easily bored and apparently thought a visit from him would help relieve them of their mutual boredom. Harry didn't remember indicating that he had signed that agreement, but Malfoy didn't seem to care. Not waiting for an invitation, the Malfoy scion approached the chair where Harry was sitting. Hedwig eyed the boy sharply. Harry grinned a little at Hedwig's protectiveness. Malfoy even gulped a little. Hedwig, is it? He asked lightly. Harry nodded. She's an intelligent owl. I know she is, Harry said proudly. She's brilliant. Can I pet her? That's up to her. She remembers you, you know. Presumably taking that as the warning it was, Malfoy hesitantly reached out, but Hedwig nipped at him. The blonde pulled his hand away in time and then scowled at Harry, who was smirking, enjoying the heck out of this. Come on, Birdie. Ouch. Okay, fine, no nicknames. Harry was sufficiently amused now. Good girl, Hedwig, he thought as he stroked her gently, but then decided to ease up on the blonde. But he had to admit, it was fun to play with him this way. Hedwig girl, Malfoy's being a little less of a prat these days. I don't think he means any harm. Harry ignored the little offended huff issued by the Slytherin at that. The owl regarded Harry, and then Malfoy with her usual strict, wise eyes. Harry nodded to Malfoy. You can try again if you want. You better not be putting her up to anything, Potter, the blonde snarked, but gently and carefully reached out. This time Hedwig let him stroke the feathers on her head. Malfoy's eyes widened. She's incredibly smooth, far more so than Ares. Ares, is that your owl? Yes. Mother got him for me right before I started at Hogwarts. Before he said anything else, Malfoy transfigured the same chair he had the night before and sat down, making himself comfortable. You could at least they've told me to make myself at home, Potter, Malfoy complained. Gee whiz, what manners. Do I need to remind you that you invited yourself? Oh, come on, Potter. I know when I'm not wanted, and you're not giving me those signs. Harry rolled his eyes. Whatever you say, Malfoy. So how long have you had Hedwig? Obviously, she was with you when you went to Hogwarts, but some witches and wizards will get their familiars earlier. I got her right before school, too. She was a gift. The first gift I remember ever getting. From someone you insulted the first time I met you, he thought, but didn't say aloud. Did you have a pet beforehand? Another owl? Harry laughed out loud despite himself. Are you serious? My muggle relativist never would have got me a pet, especially one as abnormal as an owl, Malfoy. Oh, is that so? And what do you mean by abnormal? What could be more normal than an owl? It's definitely not normal in the muggle world. There you get a cat or a dog. Sometimes people will have birds, but never owls. You'll see people get tiny songbirds like canaries, though. Well, that's just silly. A canary isn't going to be useful for transporting anything. Harry rolled his eyes, wondering if the bland boy was having him on, or if he just knew literally nothing about the muggle world. Well, obviously, muggle post isn't done via birds. Oh. How's it done then? And then the most surreal 15 minutes passed as Harry tried to explain not just the muggle postal system, but then, prompted by questions from Malfoy, continued on to try explaining muggle air travel, telephones, and the internet. The Bland seemed to have the attention span of a 3-year-old and just kept demanding more. What was next? Harry wondered in amusement, the theory of general relativity. At one point, Harry paused to appreciate what was happening. Was this really Draco Malfoy, hater of mudbloods, asking all these questions about the muggle world? I admit, some of these are pretty clever ways to get by without magic. It never occurred to me that muggles could be better than trolls in terms of intelligence, but I suppose there would have to be some range of intelligence, even among them. After all, they are human beings as well, I suppose. Who knew? Everyone other than the most inbred of purebloods, Harry thought, but just barely managed to hold his tongue. He was disgusted by the way Malfoy was talking, but then again, he'd take what he could get. If someone as prejudiced as Malfoy was willing to learn something real about muggles, then he wasn't going to risk derailing that. And here and there during the conversation, Harry had noticed Malfoy's eyes light up in genuine interest, too. It was yet another reminder that the boy wasn't all bad. He was certainly spoiled beyond belief and incredibly sheltered, and had been raised among murderers and bigots, but it was interesting to see him removed from that context. HPSSDM, over the next couple of days, a new pattern emerged in Harry's days. He would spend time in his garden in the early morning, read his potions book up until lunch, and then in the afternoon, either before or after dinner, Malfoy would stop by uninvited, of course, and despite Harry often acting annoyed at first, his annoyance was getting to be more and more feigned. They'd usually end up having a pretty enjoyable chat, sometimes over a game. Mostly wizard's chess, as that was Malfoy's preference, but the Bland also consented to a game of exploding snap, to Harry's surprise. It just didn't seem as refined as Malfoy liked to pretend he was. Bit by bit, Harry was getting used to having Malfoy around. They weren't friends, but Harry now saw Malfoy as an annoying but somewhat friendly rival. They talked about school. Apparently Malfoy liked potions, defense, or I would, if our teachers weren't all balmy, and ancient runes. Activity-wise, he loved flying, which was of no surprise to Harry. He apparently thought Harry was a total idiot for choosing divination over runes. After his experiences with divination, Harry had to concede that nearly any subject would be more interesting. He'd rather be studying troll anatomy than sitting in that humid, smoky room, hearing the teacher predict his death 80 times a session. And Harry had to admit runes sounded kind of interesting the way Malfoy talked about it. Harry had always lumped runes and arithmancy in together as one thing on his head, as the extra subjects Hermione insisted on taking, but realized now that they were totally different. Runes was more a language class, while arithmancy was closer to math. HPSSDM, Severus. Draco knew his godfather didn't normally like to be bothered in his bedroom, but it was late, and it had been hard to track the man down recently. The door made a clicking noise and opened a moment later. "Draco, is there something wrong?" Severus looked at him with concern. "Not really, Uncle Save. I just wondered if we could talk for a minute." "Of course. Come on in." Severus opened the door wider, and Draco crossed the threshold into the master bedroom that now belonged to his godfather. "Sit down, care for some tea. That would be nice." Soon they were comfortably settled on squishy armchairs with tea and scones between them. "So tell me, Draco, what did you wish to speak with me about? I guess I've just missed this, talking just you and me. I feel like we haven't been able to share more than a few words all week." Severus looked pained at the words, and Draco almost regretted saying them. "I realize that, Draco, and I apologize. I promise that as soon as I am able, we will spend much more quality time together. I'm not a kid anymore, Severus, so it's not like I need to hang on your ankles all day, every day," he hurried to assure him. "It would just be nice to go back to having tea with you after dinner or working with you in the lab a few times a week." "I feel the same." Severus leaned forward and put a hand on Draco's shoulder in a rare show of affection. "I promise to do what I can to make it happen. There are several long overdue conversations I've been meaning to have with my employer. That should help to this effect." Draco nodded and then decided not to dwell on this topic any longer. Instead, the two discussed a variety of mundane matters, such as what idiotic happenings were going on at the ministry nowadays. After wishing Severus good night, Draco passed Potter's room on his way back to his. Since Severus had been busy practically all day every day for the past week, Draco had gotten in the habit of stopping by to chat with the Gryffindor. At first, he'd thought of it as a convenient cure for his boredom. If nothing else, he figured he could get a few good shots in at the boy and let the boy's anger serve to amuse him. But though he wouldn't admit it to anyone but himself, there was another reason. He was lonely. Since coming to the manor, he'd found that if he spent a day without enough human interaction, the loneliness would get worse. And with that, a depressed feeling he really couldn't stand. Since he'd started visiting Potter, he'd found he hadn't had these upsetting bouts nearly as much. The Gryffindor served as a good distraction to keep the loneliness from setting in. But there was more to it than that. He'd found more and more that he was actually enjoying his conversations with Potter, and felt motivated to keep it up for the sake of interesting conversation, not just as a distraction from his problems. For one thing, their conversations weren't one-sided, as his with Crabbe and Goyle and even Pansy always were. Honestly, the only others he could reliably speak with this way were Theo Not, and to a certain extent, Severus. Potter always responded, and not always predictably, to Draco's remarks. He gave as good as he got, which was why the Gryffindor had always been Draco's favorite person to tease at school. Potter's habits here bothered Draco, though. The Gryffindor had gotten into a strange pattern of essentially hiding from Severus and him. Where had that come from? It even appeared Potter had a secret hiding spot to escape to. The boy had admitted that much himself. One of these days, Draco was going to tail the Gryffindor and figure out where he was heading to, but for some reason, he was holding back for now. Draco wasn't even sure why exactly, except that they seemed to have landed in a tentative state of friendly rivalry that he enjoyed. They exchanged barbs, but it was all in good fun. Nothing truly hurtful was said by either party. It was a relationship Draco was comfortable with for the time being. and he didn't want to do anything to risk that. Now that his opinion of Potter was somewhat more favorable than it had been, he found himself taking note yet again of things he'd noticed before, but had not really cared to think about. There was the boy's tendency to shoulder his problems and never ask for help, his skill at, and apparent preference for hiding, and other things that puzzled Draco, like the fact that he knew Potter loved to fly, but he hadn't gone out to fly even once to Draco's knowledge. Most likely, Potter felt too sure of Snape's response were he to even attempt to ask permission. Draco supposed he couldn't exactly fault Potter for this, as Severus did harbor a special type of dislike reserved for him. Draco did think, however, that his godfather had toned down his vitriol slightly as of late. Then there was the matter of Potter's clothing. Of course, there was the curious matter of the absolute rags he possessed, but in addition to that, the Gryffindor had obviously ordered himself new clothes, ones that were appropriate and met Severus' demands. But Draco had noticed that Potter pretty much wore the same outfit each day. Had he only ordered enough for one outfit, essentially? Why had he ordered so little? Was it stubbornness, his desire to rebel against Severus' request? Or was it something else? The patterns Draco had noticed suggested it was more a desire to slip into the background, to do the bare minimum that would allow him to meet expectations without overspending on himself. The question was, why? There was definitely something off about Potter, and Draco had the feeling the key was in his upbringing. But digging into the past was less of a priority to Draco at the moment than was simply trying to get the boy to adapt better to his current circumstances. Potter just wouldn't take the initiative to get what he wanted, and a healthy-minded Potter seemed to be of help to Draco at the moment, so he supposed he could lend a hand. And Draco had an idea that would potentially kill multiple birds with one stone. HPSSDM Friday morning started out no differently from any of Harry's days over the past week and a half. He spent half his morning in the garden and the other half in his room, making a bit more progress in potions. At lunch, he contemplated what he wanted to do for the rest of the day. Even though he'd been outside much of the morning, it was pleasant weather yet again, and he didn't fancy spending the whole afternoon inside, whether Malfoy came to pester him or not. Maybe he could explore the grounds more thoroughly. Potter, care to fly today? Harry blinked, looking up from his summer salad to meet silver eyes looking at him expectantly. Harry chanced a glance at Snape, but the man was looking elsewhere, appearing supremely bored. Could this actually work? It was his godson making the request. Professor Snape, could I, that is to say, do spit it out, Potter, Snape griped before turning to meet his eyes. The man sighed. Fine, as long as you stay out of trouble. Draco, please ensure Potter toes the line. Sure, Severus. Well, Potter. Sure. Harry chanced a glance at Malfoy, and Harry glimpsed a smirk that vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. The two ascended the stairs together, Harry's slight annoyance with Snape for taking any opportunity he could to get a little extra dig in at Harry's expense overshadowed by his building excitement. He was going to get to fly. Harry was grateful to Malfoy for taking the initiative and making the request in front of Snape like that. It was probably the most sure way that Harry would actually get permission to fly, as it would have made it a lot harder for Snape to outright reject the request. Thanks, Malfoy, Harry mumbled as they climbed the stairs, but the Blonde just waved him off. Malfoy clearly didn't want to dwell too long on having helped Harry out. That was fine. He could drop it. You might want to change into something more casual, Potter, Malfoy suggested when they got to their rooms, and Harry nodded. He was wearing his same pair of nice pants, one of his nice shirts, and his robe. Harry changed into his jeans and a green t-shirt, grabbed his broom, and then joined Malfoy back in the hallway. Together, they carried their brooms out and around to the back of the house. Harry hadn't spent much time out here, but the backyard was a large green expanse absolutely perfect for games like Quidditch. The area was far larger than a Quidditch pitch, though, 3 times the length and twice the width. Did Severus show you the game barn? Game barn? Guess not. Follow me. They walked a bit further, and then Harry noticed a small extension to the manor he hadn't noticed earlier. Malfoy opened the door, and they went inside. The barn was a single large room filled with all sorts of equipment for outdoor activities. That included brooms, Quidditch balls and equipment, including beater bats, and other types of balls and equipment Harry didn't recognize. They looked old, so perhaps they were for outdated wizard games. There was also a range of Muggle sports equipment, including tennis balls and rackets. Wow, I had no idea this was back here. Yeah, Severus doesn't use any of this stuff anymore, so I'm not surprised he forgot to show you. Malfoy went over to the area where Quidditch equipment was stored. I figured we could just fly for a bit, but perhaps a bit of Quidditch wouldn't hurt, Harry nodded. Sounds good to me, Malfoy. We will need to grab the equipment then. Harry went to take one side of a trunk that held a full set of Quidditch equipment, but noticed Malfoy was still just standing there. Can I get a little help here? Harry glared at Malfoy as he heard the boy chuckle and turned to see him roll his eyes. Potter, 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 your Muggle upbringing is showing, before taking out his wand and levitating the trunk to the door. Oh yeah, I guess that works. But for what it's worth, Malfoy, there's nothing wrong with doing stuff the Muggle way once in a while. Malfoy looked at him very dubiously. I suppose we'll have to agree to disagree. Harry just shook his head and followed the other boy out. It wasn't worth the argument. Once they were back outside, they picked up their brooms again. Harry straddled his firebolt, taking a moment to thank Sirius again for the amazing gift, and, easy as breathing, lifted off. Immediately, his face split with a huge grin. He'd almost forgotten that the feeling of flying was this incredible. He looked over his shoulder and saw Malfoy smirking at him. Glad to be back on a broom, I imagine, Harry nodded, and then shot forward. He flew to the end of the green, turned sharply, and then flew back again, doing a couple of loops. He felt so free flying around like this that he let himself laugh out loud before taking off yet again. Eventually, he noticed Malfoy was flying alongside him, keeping pace almost perfectly. The Blonde smirked at him before nodding invitingly, an obvious challenge. Harry smirked back. The two turned their brooms around to face the front of the manor and then accelerated, zipping past the manor and all the way to the gates at the end of the front manor drive. Race you back, Harry called. You'll be eating my dust. Fat chance, Malfoy. The two blasted back in the other direction, neck and neck the whole time. After 5 races, Harry had won 3 and Draco 2. It had been a close thing each time, though. The two boys landed, flushed and exhilarated. Phew, that felt good. I'd forgotten how fun it could be to really fly your heart out. In that moment, Draco Malfoy was speaking without any airs or arrogance. He was just a normal teenager, expressing honest joy in something simple. He looked like a completely different person to Harry. But even though Harry knew he'd never seen this side of Malfoy before, the boy's expression seemed so familiar. Suddenly, Harry remembered that first day when he'd accidentally wandered into Snape's study and had seen the picture of Malfoy as a kid with Snape. That was who Malfoy was reminding him of now. He seemed much more pleasant this way, too bad his default mode Wasprat. Harry had seen that picture his first time in the study, but not again since even though he'd been back in the room. Snape had probably moved the frame to keep it safe from Harry's prying eyes. Malfoy turned to Harry, still smiling that unusual, open smile. Want to play a short game of Quidditch? We need to get back in time to shower before dinner. A quick one couldn't hurt, Harry agreed. The boys opened the trunk and eventually decided to do a seeker-only game. This particular snitch was made to return obediently by pressing a button on the inside of the equipment trunk. The two wizards flew to the center of the green and Malfoy let the snitch go. It immediately darted off, and the two seekers took chase. After the first 5 minutes of trailing it, the snitch darted away out of sight, and Draco and Harry started circling the pitch, keeping their eyes peeled. Harry noticed the flash of gold first, and Draco, highly attuned to Harry's responses, as he always had been during Quidditch games, followed the boy's gaze until he too caught sight of the tiny golden ball. An instant later, they were barreling towards the grass, both reaching out, their fingertips so close to touching, and then Draco started whooping in victory. "I beat Potter! I beat Potter, Severus!" "Did you see?" he called out to the manor, though neither knew if the man had been watching the events unfold. Harry wasn't really disappointed that he'd lost. After all, Malfoy had won fair and square. "Not bad, Malfoy. You're not too awful yourself, Potter." The two grinned. "Rematch sometime. I suppose I'd consent to it," Draco drawled. Together, they carried the trunk back to the shed, and Harry only pointed out once they'd set it down that they'd carried the trunk the Muggle way. In return, he received a rude gesture from the blonde Slytherin. Harry laughed in response and started walking back the way they came. "Where are you going? The back door's faster," Malfoy said, indicating a door near the shed. Oh, he supposed it would make sense that such a large house would have more than one entrance. "I only know the front entrance. The manor has at least 4 that I'm aware of. I suppose Severus wasn't entirely thorough in his tour," the blonde sighed. "But anyway, this one is nice because it takes you right to the back staircase, so you can get back to the family wing quite quickly." The back entry was a painted wooden door. Nothing special. It led to a short hallway. Turning left at the end looked like it connected to the kitchens. To the right was the back staircase. The boys went to their respective rooms to wash up and change for dinner. HPSSDM Severus Snape watched neutrally as his godson entered the dining room, chatting with Harry Bloody Potter. Their relationship was certainly becoming more amiable. One could even categorize it as a budding friendship. Even he couldn't deny it. And while Potter was one of the last people he would choose to be Draco's friend, he would admit the relationship didn't seem to be terribly toxic. It wasn't surprising that Draco was open to the idea of friendships at the moment. Due to being essentially glued to his potions lab to complete requests from Dumbledore, Severus had been able to spend far less time than he would have liked with his godson as of late. Draco got lonely easily at the best of times, but that was even more true now. So in the absence of Severus being there for him, it was not surprising the boy had looked elsewhere. Once again, it was the fault of that old coot. Albus seemed to have decided that, now that Severus could no longer perform his duties as a spy, he should redouble his efforts to help the cause in other ways, and the orders for potions were pouring in as of late. He supposed that, given that, it was good Draco was forming some connection with the other person residing here at the moment. Severus had watched the boys out in the yard flying. Not the entire time, but much of it. He had finally finished the week's batch of potions for the order, and therefore had time to attend to other aspects of his work. He'd sat down by the window in his bedroom, potions journal in hand, and proceeded to page through his journal while keeping an eye on the young wizard's activities. A few times, he had been close to descending on them in a flurry of black robes and barking at them to fly more carefully, and he particularly wished to give them a tongue-lashing at the end when they decided to chase after that damn snitch. Severus was truly not a fan of such a reckless activity. He dearly wished he could say Potter was the instigator of all the reckless flying, but that was clearly not the case. Draco had been the one to invite Potter along in the first place, and Severus knew his godson wasn't one to make requests unless it was of his own volition. The boys seemed to be a good match when it came to flying, and Snape had to admit they were both quite talented. The fact that Draco beat Potter to the snitch was sweet. Severus had sneered, readying himself for the great Potter tantrum he expected, but the boy had accepted the defeat gracefully. It was becoming increasingly clear to Severus that Harry Potter truly wasn't a clone of his father. The man would have been insufferable in a similar situation. While they flew around outside, the two had looked like two normal 15-year-old wizards. It would have been impossible for a casual passerby to guess that this was the son of a Death Eater and the famous boy who lived. Of most import to Severus was that he could see even from where he was sitting how happy Draco had been for the entire duration of his time flying with Potter. Even after they were done, the boy seemed to have more of a spring in his step. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his chest, as if he was finally getting a reprieve from his dark thoughts after the death of his parents. Well, Severus supposed he couldn't totally deny the boy something so obviously beneficial. That it just so happened to be Potter with whom Draco had shared this time was secondary. Draco's happiness was most important. Now, as for Potter himself, if Severus were honest with himself, the boy hadn't been much of a bother the past few days. Truly, he had hardly noticed the boy's presence at all. The boy who lived had made himself impressively scarce. It was so different from the boy's typical attention-seeking behavior that it made Severus a bit suspicious. Of course, he supposed it was possible that the boy was trying to lay low after his most recent bout of rule-breaking. Unsurprisingly, Potter hadn't yet taken him up on his offer that the boy use the potions laboratory. This didn't surprise Severus at all. He doubted the boy had even opened the book he'd given him. He probably resented having been given it. Severus scowled at the thought. But Potter had been so inconspicuous lately that Severus had spent nearly an entire blessed week without the boy occupying his thoughts at all. As a result, Severus hadn't made any strides in investigating the boy's previous living situation as he'd been planning. He supposed he owed it to himself and to Potter to fulfill his promise to get a better understanding of the boy and his circumstances. He thought he could find some time in the next couple of days to grill the boy and get some answers. But spending time with Draco was his priority. The boy had even come to him the other night, clearly swallowing his pride enough to ask him directly to spend more time with him. He felt extremely guilty for not having been there for his godson over the past week. He would make sure to spend more time with Draco, and doing so had the added benefit of making sure Draco didn't spend every waking minute with Potter. While he wasn't against the two wizards developing a better relationship, he didn't want to see Draco becoming too enamored of the boy. Nor was he about to allow the boy's relationship to cut into his already limited time with Draco. Perhaps it was petty, but the thought of another Potter taking away something that was his rankled. He'd take a moment to just re-establish where they stood. Draco, Severus said, getting his godson's attention. I'm sorry I haven't been able to spend that much time with you this week. Draco blinked in surprise. No, that's all right, Severus. I understand you've been busy. Would you like to work with me in the lab over the weekend? I finally have some time that has opened up. The boy's eyes lit up, but in usual fashion he didn't drop his decorum. Of course, that would be lovely. Perhaps we can spend some time together this evening as well, if you don't have any particular plans. No, no plans. I'll be there, Severus. Feeling satisfied that he would get to spend some good quality time with the boy over the next few days, Severus dug in and enjoyed his dinner. He may have imagined the way Potter had seemed to slump in his chair a little at Severus' exchange with Draco, but he couldn't find it in himself to care either way. Hope you enjoyed. Next one will be up tomorrow. Chapter 14, Discoveries. Chapter 14, Discoveries. Thank you for your lovely comments and for reading. I hope you enjoy this one as well. When Snape had asked Malfoy to spend the weekend with him, Harry had felt the little hopeful bubble in his chest deflate a little. While Harry knew Snape still disliked him intensely, he and Malfoy seemed to be getting on better recently. Part of that, Harry thought, was that they'd actually spent some time together, talking, for the first time since they'd met. No wands, no others around to fan the flames and make the situation even more tense. But if Malfoy was going to be spending every waking moment with Snape, the man would likely poison him against Harry again, and he doubted their next interaction would be as pleasant as their last had been. Snape and Malfoy hadn't come down for lunch Saturday. When Harry arrived, he'd been concerned that perhaps he had gotten the time wrong or been late again, but his nutritive potion and meal arrived as scheduled. The other two place settings were left empty. Harry ate his meal in silence, hoping that nothing was the matter. He cursed himself for being silly. He was sure everything was fine, and the two must have just been too preoccupied with whatever potions research they were doing to even spare time to stop by for a sit-down lunch. And of course, they wouldn't think to inform Harry. Why would they feel there to be any need for something like that? When his meal popped away, it occurred to Harry that he hadn't yet visited the kitchens as he'd been planning. He made his way down a series of hallways and into the big, but still somewhat cozy, kitchen. Tilly, Nellie, and Bilby seemed to be in the middle of preparing various pastries, but stopped, their friendly faces lighting up at Harry's entrance. "Harry, it is so good to see yous. You too, guys. Sorry again for not visiting much. What are you making there?" "Lunch is over, so we Aries making tasty pastries for tea," Nellie chirped cheerily. "Would you mind if I helped? I'm not bad at baking." The house elves all started to protest, but Harry assured them that he actually truly enjoyed cooking and baking. Eventually, he was able to convince them to let him assist, and he began working on lemon tarts, something he himself enjoyed. While at first, the house elves were hovering over him, every move he made. Eventually, they seemed to accept that Harry both knew what he was doing and was doing this of his own volition. Harry relaxed into the comfort of having something to do with his hands. At the Dursleys, he'd been ordered to cook for the family, but he realized that he did enjoy the activity when he did it because he wanted to. After putting the tarts in the oven, the elves gave Harry a more thorough tour of the kitchen and some of the smaller rooms around it. They then chatted, and Harry learned a little about the manor history. Apparently, Tilly and the others had been the servants of the Prince family for a long time, along with a much larger staff. Septimus Prince, presumably Snape's grandfather, sounded like he was a traditional pureblood. Not particularly cruel, but certainly not a warm man. When the only occupant of the house was the aging head of the House of Prince, the house was apparently a very lonely place, deprived of warmth. When Master Prince died, the manor went to Mistress Eileen and young Master Severus, and they moved in soon after. So Snape's mother's name was Eileen after all, Harry noted, not Lillian. The elves smiled, describing how it was so nice to have a child around, and how Severus and Mistress Eileen were so kind, and the house itself seemed rejuvenated by them. Many rooms in the house, including the library, got refurbished with new books. The happiest times were when Master Severus's best friend would visit for the summers, Tilly exclaimed, and Harry balked at the idea that Snape had at one point had a best friend. He was tempted to ask more, but then the elves continued, and he decided to wait until later to ask. After Mistress passed away, Master Severus stayed on and insisted that he would free all the elves. Tilly shook her head sadly. Master Severus meant well, but many elves did not understand. They left to create new contracts with other families. Some went to Hogwarts too. At this point, the lemon tarts were done, and Harry and the elves sat down and enjoyed some of the pastries and tea at a little sunny table by the kitchen window. It was very pleasant. HPSSDM Severus was pleased. He was finally getting the chance to make up for lost time with Draco. They had been working side by side in the potions laboratory since morning. While they only occasionally exchanged words, Severus liked simply having his godson there beside him. Draco was starting to make progress on his potion. It was apparently intended to be a gift for him, and Draco had originally wanted it to be a surprise. But much to the boy's apparent chagrin, it had turned out to be too complex an idea for him to manage alone. Draco was trying to formulate a potion to eliminate the pain in the Dark Mark when the Dark Lord called his Death Eaters. Unfortunately, as Severus still had his Dark Mark despite being ousted as a spy, any time the Dark Lord called his followers, Severus had to endure the excruciating feeling. He was managing it so far with nerve-blocking potions and powerful occlumency shields, but it still ravaged his body a little each time. Testing the potion as it progressed was difficult, but Draco had figured out a way to do it that required a little grey borderline black magic usage. Essentially, using a Dahl charm to report its state, Draco had created his own pseudo-dark mark, put it on the Dahl, and then used it to test the potion at various stages. The fact that Severus had an enormous library of tomes, some that would not find approval in the eyes of most of the Order of the Phoenix, was of great use to Draco and Severus in this endeavor. Severus was proud of his godson. In addition to everything else, the boy had expressed his hopes that if successful, this potion could help not only Severus, but also others in Slytherin and their parents who wanted out, but were unable to leave due to their dark marks, and the pain they would have to endure were they to try pain that could literally drive one insane. Not everyone was in as fortunate a position as Severus, with unlimited access to all the sensation-blocking potions he needed, as well as being a master of clumens. Draco worked vigorously on his potion, occasionally asking Severus for help or advice. Not wanting to lose his momentum, Draco asked if they had to go all the way to the dining room come lunchtime, and Severus had consented to having the house elves bring their lunches to a small reading room next door to the potions lab. They did finally break come dinner time. Severus and Draco continued their chatting about potions theory as they entered the room and after the food arrived. At the moment, they were discussing a recent change they'd made that had sent them back a little. They tried a slightly different variety of the same ingredient, but it did not seem to emit quite as much essence as the original ingredient they'd been using. Do you think if you tried cutting it a different way, or even adding something to it to stimulate it to release more juice, that could help? We have already tried these avenues, and unfortunately, it seemed not to be of assistance. That's not entirely true, Uncle Save. At least, I didn't try everything I could have. I have an idea that might just work. Thanks, Potter. Severus froze, only now realizing that the one who had asked that question, which was not a foolish question, by any means had been Potter, who to that moment he hadn't even noticed sitting there at the table. Severus watched the boy as he shrugged, flushing a little and looking somewhat pleased. That the boy had been able to participate in their conversation to any extent was certainly unexpected. Up until now, Potter had shown no interest in or competency with potions. Was it possible that Potter had actually cracked open the potions book Severus had given him? He hadn't expected the boy to have even opened it to the title page. It was curious, but Severus decided he could always grill the boy later to determine the extent to which he'd truly made progress. He resumed eating his dinner, and afterwards invited Draco for tea and a game of wizard's chess in his study. HPSSDM, the next day was much like the previous. Harry visited his garden, this time taking a notebook with him and jotting down a few thoughts. This space was so peaceful and did much to soothe his loneliness. He didn't want to forget the feeling, so he tried to capture it in words. It was strange. He felt a real tie to this place and felt possessive of it somehow, but at the same time liked the idea of sharing it with a real friend. He considered bringing Hedwig with him sometime. It was apparently off limits to house elves, and he didn't think he wanted to share this with Malfoy, even if he no longer disliked the boy. Once again, he ate lunch alone in the dining room. Whatever the Slytherins were working on, they seemed to be pretty involved in it. Harry hadn't felt comfortable prying that much. It had taken courage to even make the little comment he had yesterday. He thought it had been a pretty safe thing to interject, and thankfully, Snape hadn't seemed mad. It had been the first time either had seemed to even notice his presence all day, honestly. For the last 2 days, Malfoy hadn't dropped in on him as had become his habit for the last week or so. As aggravating as the boy could be, Harry realized he'd started to really enjoy their conversations, even the argumentative parts. But the blonde Slytherin had spent practically the whole weekend so far with Snape, which left Harry to find ways alternative to occupy himself. Which hadn't been a problem several days ago, Harry reminded himself, annoyed that he could be so weak as to immediately become dependent on a new relationship like this. One that he wouldn't even rightly call a friendship. He had to come to terms with the fact that he no longer held any real animosity towards Draco Malfoy. If he were completely honest, he was starting to even like the blonde. Sure, he had plenty of flaws, but he was undeniably funny and smart, and had a different view of the world from what Harry was used to, but one he was pretty open to sharing. More surprising to Harry was that Malfoy seemed interested in learning more about him and his view of the world. It turned out the Slytherin wasn't a bad listener. He was curious and not as close-minded as Harry had thought he was. That being the case, Harry knew he shouldn't bemoan the Blarn the chance to spend some quality time with his godfather. Merlin knows Harry would take any chance he could get to spend time with Sirius again. At the moment, though, Harry had another afternoon to fill, and he wasn't sure how. He considered visiting the elves again. But it was then that it occurred to him he hadn't visited the library since the tour Snape gave him the other day. Pocketing his wand, he took off in the direction of the beautiful room. When he crossed the threshold, he was struck once again by the sheer number of books. The ceiling, which stretched far up above his head, had to have magical expansion charms on it, because otherwise it didn't make sense with how the house looked from the outside. It was truly magical. He spent some time just circling the room, reading the titles as he passed them. There were large sections with books related to potions, dada, wizarding history, charms, ancient runes, and every other subject you could learn at Hogwarts. But there were books on plenty of other topics as well, including curse-breaking, healing, and occlumency. Harry flinched away from that one, but didn't fail to note that if there were books on the topic, Snape could at least have recommended he read them before they'd started their lessons. Though who knows if it would have helped. Harry continued scanning the rows of books. While the overwhelming majority of them were non-fiction and many educational, there was also a large section with fiction, both novels and poetry, and not all of it was written by magical folk. Harry recognized quite a few Muggle books in the mix as well. He suddenly remembered Snape's quarters at Hogwarts and how the man had possessed Muggle books there as well. Harry didn't know that much classic literature, really, but he recognized the name Pushkin on a book of poems, as well as Mark Twain, Charles Dickens, and Jane Austen's names on novels. There were also what looked like children's books, including Muggle fairy tales. Harry stopped there, because of a particular interest he had in them in particular. Harry spotted a copy of Grimm's fairy tales that looked well loved and was jutting out a little from the shelf, as if had been put back in a hurry. Out of curiosity, he pulled the book out and looked at it. It was a beautifully bound version. He'd loved fairy tales as a kid and had always wanted to read more than he'd been able to. He opened the book, wanting to check the table of contents to see how many of these stories he knew, but then noticed some writing on one of the first pages. He curiously turned to it. "Happy birthday, Save. Tag, you're it. Let's share fairy stories again sometime soon. Love." Lily. Harry quickly snapped the book closed, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure why this note disturbed him. Who was he kidding? Of course he knew why. Lily, there it was again. Though he didn't know for sure, of course. It was likely that the person to whom his garden haven had originally belonged, or been given, was the same person to give Snape this book as a birthday gift. Because he was pretty sure, unless this was an entirely different Severus, that this Save was Severus Snape, who was the same age as his parents. And hadn't Tilly just said yesterday that Snape had a friend who would visit him in the summers? He didn't want to consider it, but he couldn't help it. Snape had clearly had a friend named Lily, and considering that Snape didn't strike Harry as the type of person to have been swimming in best friends, this Lily was presumably the same friend to visit Snape in the summertime, and was, again, probably the same Lily as Lil's from the garden. The feeling of love and comfort he always got when he visited his haven came back to him. Could it be? Could this mysterious Lily have been his mother? Had his mum been friends with Snape? It seemed absolutely impossible. And Harry didn't even want to get into how he would feel about it if it were true. He had no idea how to feel about it. Harry returned the book to its place in the bookcase, making sure it was just the way he'd found it. He imagined it wouldn't be pretty if Snape knew Harry had seen that particular note. He returned to his room and tried not to focus on his discovery, which was easier said than done. At dinner, he was silent, only stealing a few glances at Snape here and there. Could the man really have been friends with his mother? Good friends. Good enough that she would have visited him here at this manor, If so, then why did Snape treat him so horridly? What was wrong with him? He returned to his room after supper and immediately got into bed, but couldn't fall asleep for a long time. HPSSDM, how are you doing, Draco? Truly. It was Sunday evening, and Severus was enjoying another after-dinner tea with his godson. I'm better, he replied honestly. It's strange. I'm not sure if I've been able to properly mourn them, but I'm starting to feel more normal again. Flying helps, he added. I saw you beat Potter the other day, Severus said with a smile. Draco grinned at him. I figured you'd be watching. I didn't expect you to totally trust Potter and me to our own devices like that. Guilty, Severus said, taking a sip from his cup. Draco was silent for a long moment. I'm starting to realize he's not a bad guy, Severus. You might agree if you got to know him better, Severus sighed. Not this again. Draco, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm never going to be friends with Potter, even if there is such a possibility for you too. Draco looked about to protest, but seemed to change his mind. When he did speak up, he did so hesitantly. Weren't you friends with his mother? Where did you hear that? Severus snapped. My parents may have mentioned something, Severus sighed. Of course. While the younger generation had no idea, it hadn't been a secret in his own school days. And Lucius and Narcissa had been in school with him through his 5th year, so knew all about it, even if they hadn't always approved. Though they'd only really revealed their true feelings after the Muggle-born rejected him in 5th year. I'm sorry for snapping, Draco. This is not something I am comfortable discussing with anyone, Draco sighed, but nodded. I have noticed the boy is not an exact clone of his father, Draco. I will admit that he is considerably more tolerable than Potter SR. Sounds like James Potter really was an arse. That is an understatement. He and Black were truly the bane of my existence in school. I hadn't known before that Sirius Black was Potter's godfather, but I guess it makes sense if James and he were best friends. Severus sighed, clearly not enjoying the turn this conversation had taken. Yes, and a good-for-nothing godfather he turned out to be, even if his long absence wasn't entirely his fault. His brother Regulus was not so bad, however. I remember Mum mentioning him. She said he died suddenly right out of school. Yes. While no one is quite sure what happened, Regulus confided in me that he had misgivings about joining the Dark Lord, but the pressure from his banshee of a mother was too much. So you think he turned tail and the Dark Lord killed him? That, or he tried to pull some heroic stunt that ultimately killed him. He wasn't as bad as his brother, but the man had a few Gryffindorish qualities. Thankfully, they were few and far between. You must have been pretty close if he confided in you like that. I suppose. We were about as close as was safe to be in those days in Slytherin House. My friendship with Lily was different. We'd known each other since childhood. Does Potter know any of this? No, the man barked before looking apologetic. No, and please keep this information to yourself, Draco, about his mother, that is. The brat has already snooped into my personal affairs enough. He might piece it together someday. He's not actually that stupid. I will deal with that when, and if, that day comes. Draco decided to give his godfather a break and changed the subject. Remember my first trip to the manor? How could I forget? Severus smiled, reminiscing. You were an awful brat, but I had you around my little finger in no time. I will admit your skills at manipulation were above average even then. Though I must say, your bullying the house elves into giving you that tray of cookies was not your best work. Draco shrugged, sheepish. Severus, thanks. I'm not sure if I've said it, but I appreciate your taking me in and protecting me. I can't wait for this all to be over so we don't have to hide anymore. We will get him, Draco, I promise you. As soon as is possible, we will destroy the Dark Lord and start to piece our world back together. But until then, I will protect you with all that I am. Draco nodded. I know, Uncle Save. Another pause, and then Draco hesitantly asked, Dumbledore's planning on using Potter, isn't he? What do you mean, exactly? Potter told me about that farce of a protection he and his dunderheaded friends got through in his first year. It was a joke, and obviously would never have kept the Dark Lord out for a millisecond. I told him the only explanation is that it was a setup. Dumbledore probably led Potter to it, and then expected him to get through it. Also, he could face the Dark Lord. I don't know why exactly, but doesn't it seem like the man encourages Potter to be stupid more than he should if he just wanted to protect him? Severus considered his godson for a while, before sighing, a dark smile on his face. You have hit one of my key frustrations over the years precisely on the head, Draco. Though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, he said, with a genuine smile at the boy. Yes, the headmaster has continued to reward the type of reckless behavior liable to get the boy killed, which makes my job that much more difficult. Your job. As you know, I was found out to be a spy for Dumbledore. I had one very specific job that superseded all the others, though, and that was to keep Harry Potter safe. Draco's eyes widened, not expecting that in the least. The boy already has a streak of recklessness and a disturbing lack of self-preservation to start with. But it has no doubt been made worse by Albus' continued need to reward his bad behavior. I have tried to balance the man's influence by showing him that reckless behavior has consequences, but to no avail. What is it? You know the saying, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar, Severus sighed. I am aware of that, which is precisely why I am so ill-suited to this job. Anyone else would be easier, but I made a promise. To Dumbledore. Draco looked at him dubiously, seeming to know there was more to it than that. When did you become so obnoxiously perceptive? Severus snapped. Draco shrugged. Things have just been different since father and mother died. I understand, and Draco, I want to thank you for trying to help me with my problems, but I should be the one helping you. You're only 15, don't forget. Nearly 16, Draco smirked. But at least I don't have a crazy old wizard trying to force me to save the world. He has never outright admitted that these are his intentions. He holds his cards close to his chest at all times, never revealing all. But I would agree that much is obvious. I think those nightmares of his are still pretty bad. I hear him moaning sometimes at night. The Prat could at least think to use a silencing charm, Draco quipped, though Severus could tell he didn't mean it. Severus nodded. I can offer the brat some more dreamless sleep, I suppose. Thank you for noticing that. Don't you find it strange that Potter never asks for what he needs? It's like when he didn't question his bedroom situation or get new clothes. He just doesn't think to do anything to help himself, especially if he thinks he has to ask others. I believe these are just more instances of Potter enjoying playing the victim, Draco. What I think, Severus, is that Potter needs someone to convince him he's worth protecting. He doesn't seem to have the highest confidence except for during Quidditch. Maybe if he values himself more, he wouldn't throw himself in harm's way all the time, and maybe he wouldn't feel like such a victim. Severus's eyebrow was arched up to extreme heights as he regarded his godson dubiously. Potter not confident enough, Draco shrugged nonchalantly. That is what I said, yes. We must be looking at different people. That's what I was trying to tell you a week ago. Fine, Draco, I get the message. I will take your words into consideration and will try to get a clearer idea of the brat. Want me to tell you what I've noticed? No, I think we've spent enough time talking about Potter for one night. Draco looked like he wanted to say something, but Severus continued before the blonde could get a word in edgewise. I will look into it, Draco. The firm yet sincere tone of voice seemed to satisfy Draco for now, as the boy sat back in his chair at the words. Now, let's talk about something less heavy. Sounds good, Severus, Draco said, smiling at his godfather and reaching for a scone. HPSSDM, Potter. It was Monday morning, and they just finished breakfast when Snape asked Harry to hang back. Harry immediately feared the worst. What had he done now? He frantically tried to think over the events of the past day. Maybe Snape had noticed he'd touched that book after all. Apparently his nerves showed because Snape sighed and said, Relax, Potter. You haven't done anything this time, at least as far as I am aware, he said, one eyebrow arching in question. Harry shook his head quickly. Very well. Draco mentioned that you may be in need of additional dreamless sleep. Is that an accurate statement? At once, Harry was shocked that this was what Snape wanted to talk about, as well as a combination of touched that Malfoy had thought to speak up on his behalf, but also annoyed and embarrassed that he had noticed and presumed to ask Snape without first checking with him. He took a deep breath and said, I have been having nightmares, sir, but they aren't anything I can't handle. Would you like it or not? Ah, Harry thought about it. It was true the nightmares were very unpleasant. If he didn't have to endure them, I guess. Sure. Yes, sir, I would like it. Thanks, Snape nodded curtly. Very well. I will caution you again to use them sparingly. Dreamless sleep is an addictive substance, and as such can have serious consequences associated with continuous long-term use. Okay, sir. I'll be careful. Snape seemed to consider him for a while. In normal circumstances, I would recommend a mind healer to help eliminate the root cause of the dreams. As that is not a readily available option at the moment, I can instead recommend that you keep a dream journal, talk to a trusted confidant. Though as at present, you find yourself in the company of just myself and Draco, so this is not an option. The other option is occlumency. I guess I'll try the dream journal, Harry responded quickly. I presumed as much. Harry looked at the professor for a long moment. His feelings about the man after what he may have discovered were even more complicated than they had been. He didn't want to risk saying anything right now, because he knew it wouldn't come out well and therefore would not be received well. Is that all, sir? That is all, Potter. Awkwardly, Harry gave a quick thanks again, sir, and started making his way to the door. Potter, Harry froze and looked back at the man. I will ensure that you will have dreamless sleep beside your bed before sleep for the next week. In the interim, I expect you to make active use of the journal. We will assess the situation again in a week. Harry nodded and escaped from the room. HPSSDM Severus sighed. Though he didn't wish to admit it, the bloody boy who lived was concerning him somewhat. It had been some time now since the boy had acted in anything close to typical Potterish unpleasantness. In actuality, the boy had been quite meek. He would make more of an effort to check on the boy's circumstances. The last thing he needed was for the current peace to be disturbed because of problems with the boy he was unaware of. With a sigh, he left his study to his potions lab. Albus had sent him another order he needed to fill. Thank you for reading. Chapter 15. More Revelations. Chapter 15. More Revelations, another Harry and Draco-centric chapter. Enjoy. Harry felt somewhat numb as he left Snape's study. That had been a strange interaction, about as pleasant as any they'd ever had. Harry had no idea how to act around the man anymore. The idea that had now nestled its way into his head and wouldn't leave was the real possibility, as crazy as it seemed, that Snape had been friends with his mother. He wanted to be angry, even disgusted that his mother could have had such terrible taste in friends, but he'd seen evidence that Snape could be different kind, even. To those he cared for, that is. If they had been friends, then presumably his mum had only experienced this side of Snape. But she should have seen through him to the other parts of him, the fact that he was capable of being a relentless bully to a kid. And not just any kid, her own son. Even if Snape had hated his dad, a fact of which Harry was far too aware, shouldn't a positive relationship with his mom have balanced that out? Why had he always treated Harry as only James's son, and not Lily's? Desperately needing to think, Harry escaped to his garden oasis, and settled by the giant cedar, just letting the sound of rustling leaves and sunlight soothe him. He took out the notebook he'd taken to keeping in his robe pocket and began to write out his thoughts, hoping the act of writing would help him sort through them. HPSSDM Severus was back at work, which meant Draco had another free morning. He stood in an adjoining hallway when Potter rushed by, out the front door. The boy was no doubt heading to whatever hiding spot he had found for himself. Draco knew he'd told Potter he'd let him keep his secret spot, but he was curious. He crept after Potter, peeking at the front door in time to see Potter heading around to the right side of the house toward the Prince Manor gardens. He followed at a distance. Luckily, once they got into the garden area, there were plenty of trees, large bushes, and a few ornate columns to hide behind. Draco carefully followed Potter to the Japanese garden, but then the Gryffindor walked right through a solid wall of bamboo. Draco blinked and hurried to the spot he'd last seen Potter. He approached the wall and touched it. Solid. He tried casting Finite Incantatem. Nothing. He cast several other detection spells he'd learned, but there seemed to be no obvious way to get the bamboo to release its charm. Draco circled back to see if there was any way around the bamboo to some additional path, but he couldn't find any way forward. What did this mean? The area was clearly warded, but he doubted Potter knew the first thing about warding like this. And besides, he'd seemed surprised that the house elves hadn't been able to find him before. No, it seemed more likely that this was an older ward that for some reason allowed Potter through. The question was, why? To his knowledge, any blood connection Potter may have shared with the princes through the Blacks would certainly be no stronger than anything he himself had. Draco was torn. He could stake out the spot and confront Potter when he emerged, though that would be a little too Gryffindorish for his tastes. No, he would try a slightly different approach. HPSSDM Potter was once again quiet at lunch, but this time he kept shooting strange glances every so often at Severus. Draco was curious as to the reason. He made a note to interrogate Potter about it later. Potter, he stopped the Gryffindor before he was able to make a run for it from the dining room. Care to fly again? Potter looked a little surprised, but then nodded. Sure, Malfoy, that sounds fun. I'll meet you down there then. My broom's already in the barn. Potter nodded and disappeared in the direction of the family wing. Over the last few days, Draco had spent a good deal of time with Severus, which had been great. He had missed spending time with the man. Even at Hogwarts, Severus would make himself available to Draco whenever he could, and they would generally have tea together at least twice a week in his private quarters. Severus had assured him that he would at least make sure he was available for after-dinner tea a couple of times a week, even during his busiest times. Draco supposed he could live with that. He had continued his gentle nudges for Severus to try to be a little more open-minded about Potter. At first, his motivations had been purely frustration with how obtuse Severus was acting, which ran counter to how brilliant Severus Snape was in other ways. That, and the fact that his obtuseness had led him to act in a way that did not befit him. But now he admitted, as he was slowly getting to know Potter, that his fellow Hogwarts student was really not so bad to be around. There were times when he was pretty witty and sarcastic, and once in a while he reminded Draco a bit of Severus. He was mostly pretty soft-spoken and humble, which annoyed Draco a little at times, but he also seemed capable of getting interested in all sorts of topics, including academic discussions if the topic was something he knew anything about. Basically, Harry Potter had the kind of personality that usually wouldn't rub Severus the wrong way. So Draco felt a little devilish desire to push them together and see if they could actually get over their hatred of one another. It could lead to a more peaceful time here at the manor if they all got along, which was a definite perk if this all worked out. At that moment, Potter arrived, having changed into his usual t-shirt and jeans with crappy trainers. It seemed he hadn't bought new casual shoes. He was smiling, holding his broom, which Draco had been jealous of at first because firebolts were absolutely top of the line. It was unlike Potter to splurge on himself like that. It had to have been a gift. Ready to fly, Malfoy? I should be asking you the same, Potter. Potter rolled his eyes, but shot him a cheeky grin before hopping on his broom and taking off. Draco quickly followed. Your eagerness to get up in the air isn't obvious at all, Potter. Potter rolled his eyes. Can you blame me? I suppose not. Well, shall we? And with that, the two began another series of races like they had done the time before. Afterwards, they circled the manor a few times, and Draco pointed out a few areas of interest. Potter was a pretty good listener overall and seemed interested in what Draco had to say. Draco refrained from saying anything about Potter's hideout as they flew over the Japanese garden for the nth time. He would broach the topic later. After a few more races, the two slowed their pace, both exhilarated by the thrill of it. I really do love this. It's maybe the best thing about being a wizard, Potter said. That's quite the statement, but I'm not sure I disagree. Flying is excellent. I don't understand those who dislike it. Yeah, I mean, Hermione isn't a fan of flying. Draco couldn't stop himself from rolling his eyes. Well, she is, after all, a muggle-born, he quickly corrected himself. What's that supposed to mean? Potter narrowed his eyes. Nothing insulting, Potter, but flying would be a totally new thing to her, whereas it's as natural as breathing to those of us who grew up experiencing it. That's shite, and you know it. Just look at me. I'm basically muggle-born as far as my family situation goes, so I sure hadn't flown before. It just depends on the person. Heck, I didn't know magic existed at all before Hagrid brought me my Hogwarts letter. Draco had been leisurely gliding around as he and Potter spoke, but at the Gryffindor's words, he ground to a halt. There were so many revelations and bizarre things in what Potter just said that he was having trouble figuring out where to start. Wait, what do you mean you didn't know magic existed before that? And Hagrid brought you your letter? Potter nodded. Yeah, he said, as if it were no big deal, as if Draco should already have known this. Well, Draco hadn't known this. So let me get this straight. Your muggle relatives never told you anything about magic whatsoever. Potter shook his head, now looking angry. Why? Why? They didn't understand it, and so they feared it, and that fear turned to hatred. And as I was the constant reminder of it in their lives, I was their main target. They tried to do what they could to beat the magic out of me and keep any reminder of me and my freakishness to a minimum. I was never wanted in that house, not for a second. Draco blinked, quite shocked Potter was revealing this to him. He was also surprised to realize he felt angry on Potter's behalf and didn't feel any desire to use it against him. Those muggle bastards, he growled. You didn't deserve that, Potter. Potter stared at him, looking surprised and a little vulnerable. He shrugged. It wasn't as bad as all that. I got good at hiding, lying low and all. Suddenly a lot of things make all sorts of sense, Draco muttered. And there were some good things, Potter said, his eyes lighting up in glee. Oh, there was the time we went to the zoo. Zoo. Potter took a moment to explain what a zoo was. And in the reptile house, there was a large boa constrictor. My cousin Dudley was being an ass as usual, and I vanished the glass between him and the snake. You should have heard the way he squealed like a stuck pick, which is so appropriate, by the way, as that snake passed right by him. From the way Potter described him, Draco had a feeling his cousin looked a bit piggish as well. And Hagrid was sent to get you. That's strange. Potter then described a strange series of events that ended with Hagrid busting down a door to a shack in the middle of a body of water before revealing Potter's magical status and taking him to Diagon Alley. Potter looked at him strangely. One of the early reasons you and I didn't get on, Malfoy, was that when we met in Madame Malkin's, one of the first things you did was insult Hagrid. To me, Hagrid was my savior, the person to introduce me to the magical world and take me away from my awful relatives. So I didn't like that you said nasty stuff about him. Draco's eyes widened. He couldn't even remember meeting Potter in Madame Malkin's. I see. I suppose I can understand that. I don't remember that interaction much, though I do remember our conversation on the train. And there again, you managed to insult the next group of people who had been really nice to me. I'd never had friends before because Dudley always beat them up if they talked to me, and I saw Ron as my first chance at that. I didn't want to lose it, and then you kind of reminded me of Dudley, honestly, so I reminded you of that muggle. Draco knew he sounded horrified and offended because he was. At the same time, he could kind of see how, to someone as beaten down as Potter had clearly been, 11-year-old him would have been a bit much, that he could have perhaps come off as a prat. He had to admit he had been pretty spoiled and bratty back then. So that's why. He knew he sounded vulnerable, but he couldn't help it. It still felt like a raw wound all these years later. Potter looked curious. You didn't take my hand when offered. Potter's eyes widened. You high guess. Potter looked curious, damn him. I'm sorry, Malfoy. I guess I didn't realize it was that big a deal. I mean, I guess it was rude of me, but you offered your hand while basically insulting Ron at the same time, acting like he was inferior to you, when I felt much more like Ron than like you, Crabbe and Goyle. In pureblood society, rejecting a handshake is a great slight. It essentially means you don't think the other worthy of touching your hands, that they are unclean. Potter's eyes widened at the revelation. I didn't know any of that. I realize that now. But at the time, I saw you as the famous Harry Potter, son of the ancient house of Potter, and as the Potter heir, surely you would know all these customs. But that's obviously not true, Draco ended wryly. Potter was nodding, and then suddenly flew closer. Will you let me fix that? Wah, Draco cursed himself for sounding so unlike himself. I'm Harry Potter. I look forward to finally getting to know you. Draco blinked in shock, staring frozen at Potter's outstretched hand. Slowly, Draco reached forward and took it. HPSSDM, their conversation had taken a turn that had completely derailed anything Draco had wanted to talk about. He got another shot at it, though. Potter, since we've got a little time still before dinner, can I show you something? Potter nodded and followed him as he flew around the manor, landing around the beginning of the Japanese garden. I used to love this place, Draco started. Occasionally I get Severus to let us have Japanese tea out here under the umbrellas. Draco indicated the little tea house in the middle of a small pond of water lilies you could cross by walking across an arched wooden bridge. I didn't even notice that area when I first saw this garden, Potter remarked. There's more to this place than meets the eye for sure. This part is pretty hidden behind a maze of bamboo, isn't it? Draco then walked along the main path until they got very close to where Draco had seen Potter disappear. This area is strange to me. It certainly feels like it ought to go somewhere, and yet it's nothing but a wall of bamboo. Draco saw the look of surprise on Potter's face. But it doesn't look that way to you, does it, Potter? Potter frowned. What are you saying? I'm saying I believe there is a special ward in this wall of bamboo that allows you through, but not me. The question is, why? Potter looked bursting to say something, and then the curiosity seemed to be too much. So you really can't see anything here? That's right. You've been visiting this manor all these years, but never. Draco shook his head. Finally, Potter sighed. I suppose there's no harm in telling you, especially if you can't even see it. And then Potter described the forest path leading to an ancient cedar and special garden. The garden is marked. It's called Lil's Secret Garden. Draco could feel his eyes widen. Now it made some sense to him why Potter may have access, but he wouldn't. Sounds like a name a child would give something, he remarked. Potter nodded, gulping. If you can't get in, but I can, then maybe it really is true. Draco tried to gently push Potter to give him more. Malfoy, I've seen some evidence recently that suggests Snape might have been friends with my mum. And you're suggesting this garden is something that either she made or she and Severus made together. The look on Potter's face suggested he fully expected Draco to call him crazy. Draco so enjoyed disappointing Potter. It makes sense to me, Potter. It does. Deciding Potter wouldn't appreciate his holding much back after he just offered his hand in truce, friendship, solidarity. And figuring it made no sense to pretend considering Potter had figured out this much, Draco looked Potter in the eye and said, It does, Potter. He took a deep breath and continued. Because I happen to know for a fact that your mother and Severus were childhood friends that continued to have quite a close relationship all through Hogwarts. You, they, what? I'm surprised you don't know. Sirius, Lupin, and many others went to school together with Severus and your mother. My parents did as well, which is why I know. It wasn't this grand secret back then, though I do believe Severus was given some hell in Slytherin due to his friendship with a Muggle-born, so he tried to play it down. Didn't stop them from studying together in the library, though. Potter looked beyond shocked. They were. They had to be close. For her to have come here, even, I don't know that much about it, but yes, I think they must have been quite close friends at one point. I just don't understand why he hates me so much, Potter whispered, and Draco actually felt bad for him. Look, Potter. I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but if you ask me, I think it was more than just friendship, at least from Severus' perspective. Draco almost laughed at how disgusted Potter looked. Severus is one of my favorite people, but I know he has a jealous streak. And my guess is that he saw your father as both his schoolyard enemy and his rival, and James Potter won. You're the evidence of that, he shrugged. I'm going to need some time to let this sink in, Harry muttered. Potter, Draco gave him his most serious look. Do not let Severus know that I told you all this. You know what a private person he is. You may have figured a lot of this out on your own, but by confirming it, I am breaking his confidence. Trust me, I get it. I'll try not to let on that I know. And if I do, I'll make sure he thinks I just put the pieces together on my own. Potter gave him a weak smile. I appreciate the information, Malfoy. I don't actually know much of anything about my mum, but Snape is the last person I expect would like to share a heart-to-heart with me about her. Draco chuckled. That is almost certainly true, Potter. Well, shall we get back? Harry nodded. Slightly shorter chapter things will finally start moving with Severus in the next few chapters. Let me know your thoughts. Chapter 16. Potions and Family History. Chapter 16. Potions and Family History. As always, thank you for reading. After the revelations of the day before, Harry decided to again lay low and not give Snape any reason to go after him. He couldn't stop himself from watching the man all through breakfast, though. It was so bizarre to think that his mother had been friends with the potions master. It was hard to get over, but obviously she'd seen something in him to like. Unfortunately, Harry didn't know anything about his mother, really, so there was no way for him to wonder what she might have had in common with the man. Professor Flitwick had mentioned that his mum was good in his class, but other than that, pretty much all he knew about his mum was that she had died to save him and that he had her eyes. The same things that everyone in the wizarding world knew about her. How sad was that, he thought angrily, that his mum was such a stranger to him. Why hadn't he asked Sirius and Remus more questions about her? They told him some things about his dad, but next to nothing about his mum. He supposed he could write Remus to ask for some details, but he was wary of bothering the werewolf too much right now, and was especially wary of dredging up the past so soon after he'd led Sirius into that trap. He tried to shake away the negative thoughts. He was focusing on his mum right now. He'd knew Sirius and Remus had been more his dad's friends than his mum's, but as for who his mum's friends had been, well, he'd had no clue until now. How weird that he, Harry, knew nothing about his mum, but sitting right in front of him was perhaps the one person who knew more about her than anyone else still living. It was frustrating to know this potential well of knowledge was right here, and yet so inaccessible. The distance between himself and Snape was vast. At this point, there was no way he could learn anything about his mother from him, but maybe there was a way to cross the gulf between them. He'd need to do it sneakily, little by little. Perhaps he could make use of some of that Slytherin cunning the Hat had insisted was a part of him. He had to start somewhere. Ugh! He cleared his throat at a break in Snape and Malfoy's breakfast discussion. The two Slytherins looked his way. Professor Snape. Potter. Snape raised a single eyebrow in question. I was hoping maybe I could use the second potions lab today. I wanted to try out some of the different methods for slicing ingredients explained in the book. Snape looked surprised, but not exactly displeased. After a long moment, he responded, That would be amenable, Potter. You may accompany me directly after breakfast unless you need some items from your room. Harry swallowed. Well, I kind of wanted to change into something else and maybe grab my book. Make sure to wear a robe. Your Hogwarts robe will do if you do not wish to wear your nicer attire. While you should always make a habit of setting a charm to prevent your potion from contacting you were it to splash out, it is still a good rule of thumb to wear some protection. Your robe serves as that. Right, Harry blinked. Thanks, sir, I'll do that. See you in a few minutes. And with that, Harry hurried back up to his room. As he moved through the hallways, it occurred to him that this was the first time Severus Snape had ever offered him helpful advice related to potions making, and he'd done it without a sneer or a snide remark. Harry changed into his jeans, t-shirt and Hogwarts robe, grabbed his potions book, and then hurried back down the stairs. HPSSDM, when Harry entered the room, he paused. Sure, Snape had said he would meet him down here, but Harry had been under the impression he would be using a separate lab from Snape so as not to disturb him as he worked. Oh, sorry, sir. Is this the wrong lab? Don't be foolish, Potter. No. I simply figured that, given this is your first time engaging in these activities, I might stay nearby so as to ensure you can manage yourself sufficiently so as not to destroy my potions lab. Harry was about to open his mouth to protest out of habit, but he stopped when he saw one edge of the potion master's lips curl up an infinitesimal amount. Maybe the man was trying to make a joke. Perhaps he was there for other reasons he didn't want to admit. Either way, Harry decided to shrug, drop it, and get set up. There was a workstation at a table about 5 feet to the left of the table where Snape was working. A cauldron was already there. Tools can be found along the back wall. I believe you are familiar with the storeroom. Take what you require for your exercise and no more. Harry nodded and went to the back of the room, carefully selecting a number of tools so he could try different methods of preparing simple ingredients, as that was his main plan for today. A simple exercise, but one he wanted to try out nevertheless. He went to the back storeroom and grabbed a handful of quite typical ingredients: caterpillars, bloodroot, bat spleen, and a variety of mushrooms. Before he began, he turned to Snape and decided to risk a question. Ah, sir. Can you teach me how to create the splash shield you mentioned? Snape rolled his eyes, but nevertheless showed Harry the incantation without making any truly snide remarks. Thank you, Harry said quietly, and then began sorting his ingredients. Those he chose to work with could all be prepared using more than one preparation method. He had the most mushrooms, so he prepared them all differently: sliced one, cubed another, minced a third, ground another with mortar and pestle, and so on and so forth. Once he was done, Harry decided to try talking to Snape again. The man hadn't bitten his head off yet. Would you mind checking my work, sir? Snape didn't say anything for a long while, but Harry noticed it seemed he was in the middle of a step in a potion of his own. Concerned that he'd messed up, Harry stayed still as he could, watching as the wizard finally stopped stirring, blew on it once harshly, and then cast a stasis spell before finally walking over to Harry's work table. Show me what you have. Yes, sir. Harry showed Snape the way he'd sorted his ingredients by preparation method and asked if it looked like he was essentially doing it correctly. Snape closely examined them, taking a knife of his own and moving them around. Overall, not horrendous, Potter. I would make a few adjustments to the way you diced these mushrooms, however. Show me how you were holding your knife. Harry grabbed his knife and tried to position his hand as he had when he was cutting the ingredients. Try this instead. Snape showed him how he gripped his knife. It should give you more control, making it easier to make precise and even cuts. Harry nodded and thanked Snape. HPSSDM Potter was continuing to surprise him. Yes, the exercise he had performed was laughably basic, but yet the care and attention to detail Potter had put into his work was anything but. It was far more effort that Severus had expected him to put in. Was the boy up to something? He wouldn't have put it past the boy to have only read the introductory section on slicing ingredients, but was trying to make that out to be more than it was in an effort to make himself look good. To what end? Severus was not sure. And he admitted this approach was a bit too Slytherin to be typical for Potter. Well, there was an easy way to determine if the boy's newfound interest in potions was genuine. He could simply probe. You seem to have opened that book I lent you after all, Potter. What are your impressions thus far? Major takeaways from the first several chapters. Severus was genuinely surprised when Potter actually perked up at the question. He'd expected the boy would feel put on the spot if he had simply read only the very beginning. I'm actually really enjoying it. Honestly, I wish I'd read this years ago, because I think it would have helped me do better in class. It really lays out the importance of focusing not on just following instructions, but on understanding all the different components that affect a potion, and then understanding their interactions so you can reason through how to make a potion do what you want it to. It's both a logical and creative art. Can you believe I didn't even realize why it mattered whether you sliced or minced ingredients? Oh, and the section that goes over variations on the draft of living death was really interesting. To think that just warming the powdered root of asphodel before adding it would make the potion that much more powerful to even work on giants was pretty surprising. Draco helped me understand why, because I wasn't so sure about that part. Severus wondered if the boy had forgotten who he was speaking to. Potter had never used such a tone full of excitement and genuine interest in his presence before. Severus also wondered if Potter realized he'd referred to his godson by his given name. He imagined he hadn't. The boy seemed to be off in his own world. Sure enough, when Potter finished, he blushed and then looked down self-consciously, as if not sure what Severus was going to say about his rant. He probably assumed Severus would be mad, especially as the impertinent boy had managed to insult his teaching multiple times by suggesting he had only now, after years of being in Severus classes, learned these basics. But in truth, Severus was frozen by a very different emotion than anger. In fact, he found himself lost for words, something he did not often experience. Yes, he felt some irritation at the boy for calling out his insufficiencies as a teacher, but overriding that was a combination of pleasant surprise and guilt, because it was true that he hadn't made an effort to ensure his students understood those basics, in part because he honestly hadn't thought most of them would care to learn them. To him, it had always seemed that students either wanted to do well or not. Never one to be fond of coddling others, as he himself hadn't been coddled as a boy. He had felt that if a student cared to learn the material, they would seek out the supplemental reading on their own, and therefore come to understand the things that Potter was only now discovering. For those that didn't bother to do that, Severus figured they lacked the requisite desire to do well enough in the first place, and so he didn't try to cover those finer and more interesting nuances that, in his opinion, made potions worth doing. But here was Potter proving him wrong. Severus would immediately have put him in the camp of lazy students who didn't care, and to whom the supplemental information wouldn't make any difference. And yet, now that the boy had found this information, he was talking about potions with interest, and furthermore with insight. The boy spoke about it as if he'd been living and breathing the subject, something Severus would expect of a star pupil. This interest was something James Potter had never shown in any subject. He did well in classes, but it all seemed like a game to him, and he was always happy to show off to others. But Harry Potter wasn't showing off, as much as Severus would have called it that in the past, he realized with some shame. No, he was simply expressing sincere interest in new information he had come upon. The passion Harry Potter was showing reminded him of no one so much as a combination of Lily and himself. Perhaps there were others like Potter who would have flourished were he to have exhibited a somewhat more generous and patient approach in his teaching. Noticing the boy was starting to look quite nervous at his silence, he cleared his throat and willed his voice box to cooperate. I see. Those insights are not altogether uninteresting. The boy's pitifully grateful look at not getting scolded for his words irked Severus, who pushed on, suddenly desiring to end their session for the day. Potter, as I mentioned previously, you may continue to use the potions labs as you wish. While I request you check with me the day of so we can ascertain any conflicts, you have been sufficiently respectful today, and so it should not pose a problem for you to use it again in the future." The boy looked up at him, and a tentative smile found its way onto his face. "Ah, great, sir. That sounds good." It occurred to Severus that this was the first time in many years that he'd seen anything resembling that smile. HPSSDM. So, how did it go? Malfoy was standing in the door to his bedroom as Harry passed. Harry raised an eyebrow. "Have you really been waiting all this time for juicy details? So rude. And here I was, planning on inviting you in." Despite himself, Harry was curious. Despite Malfoy being one room over and the Bland having barged into his room multiple times, Harry had yet to see the Bland's space. At one point, Harry would have assumed it would be full of dark artifacts and slithering colors. Now Harry expected it to be much more normal than that. "Sorry, Malfoy," Harry chuckled. "HMPH." The Bland sniffed, but then sighed and opened his door. "This way, Potter." Harry followed him in. While this room had the same basic layout as his own, it looked much more like an actual bedroom, rather than the guest room Harry's room was. I suppose it makes sense. Now that Malfoy's parents are dead, he's supposed to be living here permanently with Snape. For a moment, a wave of uncertainty washed over Harry. For him, this living situation was temporary. Who knew where he would be next summer or the one after? Would it be better or worse than here? Could he go to the Weasleys? But no, he'd always be a guest there, no matter how nice they were to him. Then Grimmauld Place, alone. He shuddered at the thought. Pushing the uncomfortable thoughts away, Harry examined his surroundings. Yes, Malfoy had his silver and green Slytherin banner on the wall, and the room had a general theme of black, forest green, and dark brown wood. But this just lent the room a coziness. These were nature colors, forest colors. He realized he liked the feeling it gave the room. Malfoy's bookcase was full, and he had a variety of knickknacks laid out on his shelves. There was a cozy-looking blanket on the window seat, and a small stack of books lying beside it. Things in the room weren't quite as organized-looking or perfect as he would have expected of the pureblood heir. On a table next to the Bland's bed, Harry spotted a little white stuffed dragon. He had to stop himself from drawing attention to it, as he was likely to offend the Bland if he did, and instead turned to examine the picture frames that lined a shelf by Malfoy's desk. Except for one which looked to be Malfoy's parents on their wedding day, all the pictures were of Draco surrounded by others. In one, Draco was a little kid with Snape. This one was similar to the picture Harry had seen in Snape's study. Another was a formal-looking picture of Draco with his parents. The boy looked how Harry remembered him on the Hogwarts Express that first time they met. This was probably taken right before Draco set off to Hogwarts. All three looked like the stereotypical cool, cold, pureblood family. Yet another was of a younger Draco with his parents. In this one, though, Draco's mother had her arms around him from the back, genuine warmth in her eyes. Lucius Malfoy stood off to the side, not quite smiling, but his expression was more gentle than any Harry had ever seen on the man. There was another picture of Draco with some Slytherin students Harry recognized. Theo Knott, Blaise Zabini, Crabbe, Goyle, Pansy Parkinson, and two blonde girls that looked like sisters. Was their last name Greengrass? The older one was Daphne, Harry was pretty sure. She had never made much of an impression on him. But then again, she'd also never gotten involved in any of the Gryffindor baiting as far as he could remember. It occurred to Harry that it was probably a big deal for Malfoy to let him into his room and let him see these pictures. Especially the one of Malfoy and his parents was obviously of quite a private moment. The couple in that picture were not the Lucius and Narcissa Malfoy Harry remembered. Ah, Malfoy, who is the younger blonde here? These two are the Greengrass sisters, right? Who might I sense a crush, Potter? Malfoy asked, smirking. What? No, I'm just curious because I know everyone else. Keep your knickers on, Potter. I'm just teasing. Yes, these are the Greengrass sisters, Daphne and Astoria. I've known them for a while, of course, and that's not just because of the marriage contract. A marriage contract? Harry sputtered, completely thrown off. Well, yes. Malfoy looked at him with a raised eyebrow like Harry was the one who had said something strange. I'm heir to an ancient pureblood line. Of course, other purebloods would have been climbing over each other to make a contract with my parents to this effect. Oh, I forget that you are not familiar with our customs, Potter. It is so easy to think of you as normal. Normal. You mean pureblood, Harry snarked. That's what normalisto me, Potter. It's the world I know, Malfoy shrugged. Harry nodded. So you're engaged to Daphne Greengrass. Astoria, actually. Though, technically, the contract was never binding, and that is especially so now that my parents, Malfoy, drifted off, and Harry decided to change the subject. He hadn't meant to depress the boy. Anyway, you were asking about how things went with Snape. Ah, yes. And like that, Malfoy perked right back up and half dragged Harry over to a chair over by the window. Malfoy relaxed on the window seat, lounging back, his feet up. So nothing. There's really not much to say. Did you actually manage to spend what was it, 2 hours, alone with Severus without either of you biting the other's head off? Yeah, I guess. It wasn't too bad this time. Well, that's progress, isn't it, Potter? I guess. I figured it would be to my benefit to see if it's possible for Snape to be a little more pleasant, though I'm not holding my breath. How Slytherin of you, Potter. I have reasons. Your mother, I presume. Harry started to snap at Malfoy out of habit, but sighed. The Blonde had been the one to confirm Snape and his mother's relationship, after all. Well, yeah. Isn't it insane that I probably know no more, maybe even less, about my own mother than the average witch or wizard? She was good at charms. I have her eyes. She died to save me, blah, blah, blah. And now I learn she was apparently Snape's friend, and even you knew that before I did. Like what the hell? Malfoy just nodded, apparently content to let Harry rant. It's shite. And I know Snape knows all this stuff about her, but he may as well be a muggle portrait for all that he's likely to tell me anything. I can try to warm Severus up to you, Potter. Sounds like it could kill multiple birds with one stone. Okay, and seriously, why are you being so nice? Like, what are you trying to get out of this? Why do you even care, Malfoy? The Blonde looked hurt at his question, so Harry backpedaled. Look, that didn't come out right. It's just, well, you've been really decent recently. I appreciate your inviting me out to fly and all, and it's kind of nice to have someone to talk to like this, but I just don't get why you'd care that Snape and I get along. Think of it as curiosity, Potter, more than actually caring. Harry looked at him dubiously. Although, the Blonde sighed, I will admit that I wouldn't mind having a little peace this summer, and you two constantly being at each other's throats does not contribute to a nice, relaxing summer in my book. The Blonde looked defensive suddenly. Is that so wrong? Harry shook his head. No, it isn't. I'm the same way. My summers have been pretty shite up until now. He regretted his words after he said them, not wanting to get on the topic of the Dursleys again. Well, considering you lived with those repulsive muggles, that's not surprising. Shite. Well, what about you, Malfoy? What would your summers normally look like? Harry was relieved when Malfoy took the bait. He may have let some stuff about his childhood slip to Malfoy the previous day, but he didn't really want to get into the details. Malfoy told him then about the summer cottages his mother would take him to in Italy and France, about how much his mother loved the ocean. He also mentioned the fancy balls he attended each year, sometimes hosted at Malfoy Manor, sometimes not, and generally who all would be in attendance at such events. So you've known Parkinson and the others since you were kids then? Oh, yes. And it's a good thing the contract was with Astoria, not Pansy, because she would have been absolutely insufferable otherwise, he muttered under his breath. I always thought she liked you. Draco gave a long, suffering sigh. Pansy's like an obnoxious sister to me. I have tried to explain this to her on numerous occasions. Harry chuckled at the look on the Blonde's face. But anyway, we've all known each other since we were kids, but honestly it wasn't until Hogwarts that we really got to know each other for real. Until then, we were all just stuck together out of boredom, but we're always too concerned with looking good and not embarrassing our family names to loosen up and really talk. Sounds like pureblood society can be a little stiff and constraining, I suppose. There's a great difference between the face you present to the world and the one you reserve for your family. Isn't that tiring, though? Even at Hogwarts, you have to present that other face, right? To an extent. But you get used to it, Potter, Malfoy shrugged. For what it's worth, I think I like the private face more, Harry said quietly. And how exactly do you know you've seen that face, Potter? Just a feeling. You're much easier to talk to when you're not trying to be the perfect Malfoy heir. When you're just being yourself, just Draco, you're not so bad. The blonde was staring at him before shaking his head. If this had been just a week or two ago, I never would have let you get away with saying something like that to me. Malfoy then smirked devilishly. And when exactly did I give you permission to use my given name? Harry froze, had he? Oh, sorry, Malfoy. The blonde shrugged. Look, Potter, I wouldn't normally do this, but seeing as we're essentially roommates this summer, I suppose I can make a special exception in this case and allow you to call me Draco. I maintain the right to rescind this offer, however, he said haughtily. Harry stared at the blonde in shock. Really? Well, okay, Dr. Draco. The Slytherin was now smirking at him. That sounded painful. Shut up, Harry snarled playfully. Fine then, you can call me Harry then, if you want. No harm in trying it out, I suppose. So Harry, did Severus give you permission to visit the lab again? He did, yeah. That's an encouraging sign. Severus is warming up to you for sure. I admit he's being much more fair, but I'm also trying hard not to upset him. That's definitely a good idea. Severus has such a beef against James Potter, it takes next to nothing to send him back into dark black hatred. Harry gulped. Draco, do you know? So apparently Snape liked my mum and hated my dad. Do you know much about his relationship with my dad? Was it like you and me, basically? Draco hesitated, suddenly looking uncomfortable. I am most certainly not the right one to answer that. But he sighed and continued. Look, I can just tell you what I've heard, and from people who have their own biases, mind you. Father told me James Potter and his gang of friends, Sirius, Lupin, and Pettigrew, would take Severus on 4 against 1, and were often pretty cruel with their words and their actions. So it sounds like it was worse. Harry felt his heart sinking. So they really were bullies to Snape then. Then again, he said that Severus gave as good as he got and rejected other Slytherin's efforts to assist. Out of pride, no doubt. And Mother said James Potter matured and got much better his last year at Hogwarts. He even apparently tried to reconcile their relationship to a certain extent. What did you say? Their relationship? Whose exactly? My mother and James's. What sort of relationship would my dad have with your mum? Harry was completely confused now. From family gatherings and all. Do you mean to say? Draco stared at him for a long moment. You don't even know your family tree. I figured that Sirius being your godfather and all you would have learned at some point. I literally have no idea what you're talking about, Malfoy. Wait a moment. Draco stood up and hurried over to his bookcase. He selected a big heavy tome and levitated it over to where he'd been sitting with Harry. Harry leaned down to read the title of the book. It's just the Black Family Grimoire. I have my mother's copy. Your mother's a black. Of course, Malfoy said slowly, staring at Harry like he was an absolute idiot. She was Narcissa Black by birth. See. Draco opened the book to a page completely filled with an incredibly detailed family tree. Harry squinted at it, but Draco touched one section of it, and it immediately enlarged that area, making it easy for Harry to make out. Sure enough, there was Draco's name, under Lucius Malfoy and Narcissa Black. Next to Narcissa were her sisters Andromeda, Tonks's mom. Harry noted internally and Bellatrix. Harry felt sick and looked away. What is it? Nothing. I'd forgotten you were related to Bellatrix. He spat the name. Of course, she's my mother's older sister. She's the monster that killed Sirius, Harry snarled. Why are you snarling at me all of a sudden? I know Bella's a psycho bitch. I sure as hell don't like her. She's always creeped me out. And blood clearly means next to nothing to her since she killed Sirius, who was her first cousin. Just like he was my mother's first cousin, though that actually seemed to mean something to my mother. Are you suggesting Bellatrix being related to me somehow makes me like her? Harry took a few deep breaths before shaking his head. No, sorry, Draco. I know that's not true. I should know you shouldn't judge someone based on their relatives. It's just, seeing her name reminded me of that night. He felt kind of ashamed now for lashing out at the blonde. In fact, he'd been lashing out a lot today. Good. Draco seemed somewhat mollified. Because don't forget, the reason we started this nice stroll down memory lane was to show you how your father and my mother, and therefore you and I are related. Harry blinked. Somehow, the thought of James and Narcissa having some relation hadn't made it register that this meant he and Draco were related. The thought wasn't as horrific as it once would have been. Granted, it's a very distant relation. I believe you and I are third cousins. The Blacks intermarried with so many of the great pureblood families that you and I are related to plenty of our classmates. Here, look. Harry looked where Draco was pointing. You see my mother here. These are her parents, Cygnus Black and Drula Rosia. Well, Cygnus had two siblings, Alfred and Walburga. Walburga married her cousin Orion and miraculously had two sons less crazy than she supposedly was. Serious, Harry whispered, feeling sad. I don't know much about Regulus, but I know the crazy house elf at the Black family home worships him to this day. Regulus was apparently a good sort, though much more serious than serious, Draco said, before stopping and grimacing at Harry, daring him to call him out on the unintentional pun. Anyway, Mother spoke quite fondly of him. Apparently he adored Sirius, but Sirius didn't really talk to him once Regulus went into Slytherin. I see. Harry decided he would stew on that little detail later. Anyway, getting back on topic. My mother's parents were Pollux Black and Irma Crabbe. Pollux had a few siblings, Cassiopeia, who never married or had children, Marius, a squib, and Doria, who married Charles Potter. They only had one son, late in life. Harry traced the tree to his father's name, saw where it connected to a placeholder with no name that was obviously his mother, and below them, him. I had no idea my dad's family was so interconnected. Draco chuckled at how Harry kept tracing the lines. It's easy to get lost in it, Potter. I know it's pretty interesting. I'm related to Ron, Harry squeaked. Draco rolled his eyes. Yes, of course, and Longbottom. Thankfully, now we're getting into truly distant relations. Harry gave him a half-hearted glare. Purebloods just take for granted that they are probably related somewhere down the line. It doesn't matter much when it comes right down to it. That's not to say family isn't important. It is, extremely, but even purebloods stop following it so much after a certain point. Harry now remembered that he had seen part of this tree before, when Sirius had shown him around Grimmauld Place. Unlike on the large, wall-sized version of the tree Harry had seen then, which had been marred by Sirius Mother's wand blasts, Sirius, Andromeda, and Tonks were all still listed in the grimoire. Draco, what time is it? The blonde blinked and cast a quick Tempest charm. Oh, bollocks. We've got literally 1 minute before we're expected in the dining room. At Harry's nervous look, Draco smirked. No worries. We can use the flue when we're just going between rooms in the manor. Come on, Harry. This was the first time the blonde had used his name without a sarcastic edge, Harry realized. It didn't feel as strange as he'd expected it to. Harry watched as Draco grabbed some flue powder from the mantel and called kitchens before disappearing. Harry sighed. He hated traveling by flue, but followed a moment later, landing on his arse in the Prince Manor kitchen, the elves starting to worry over him. Draco was laughing at him, but then cast a quick Scourgify and offered his hand. Let's go. Severus won't be pleased if we're too late. Together, the two hurried into the dining room to find Snape looking at them curiously, one eyebrow arching up at the two boys joining him together, both a minute late. Harry was surprised once again when Draco made a smooth excuse for the both of them which Snape seemed to accept. After that, they settled into somewhat comfortable lunchtime conversation. Some progress. Note, things will be speeding up. Please let me know what you thought and thanks for reading.